The pharmacist's hand closed around my wrist before I could take my prescription bag off the counter. She was young, maybe 28, with dark eyes that carried something urgent and frightened behind them. She leaned forward and dropped her voice to barely above a whisper, glancing once at the customer behind me in line. Mr. Mercer. Her name tag read Nina. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't eat or drink anything your son brings you. Not until you've talked to someone. She pressed the bag into my hand. Please. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out with my free hand and read the message on the screen. Dad, Vanessa made a pot of that lamb stew you love. I'm bringing dinner tonight. Be there at 6. Don't eat beforehand. I stood in the middle of Ridgeway Pharmacy on a gray Tuesday in February, holding my blood pressure medication in one hand and my phone in the other, and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the weather outside. 3 months. That's how long it had been since the headaches started. Since the mornings when I woke up and couldn't remember if I'd already made coffee or just dreamed about making it. Since my hands had started trembling in a way my doctor called age-related and adjusted my medication twice without improvement. Since my son Derek had started calling every single day, his voice wrapped in a warmth I hadn't heard from him in years, asking how I was feeling, offering to bring groceries, suggesting gently, carefully, like a man testing ice that maybe I shouldn't be driving as much. I was 64 years old. I had spent 31 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, tracking fraud schemes so intricate they looked like abstract art from the outside and like theft from the inside. I knew how to read a pattern. Standing in that pharmacy, I finally let myself read this one. It had started the way these things always do, with something that looked like love. Derek called on a Sunday morning in early November. The first real call in over a year of polite monthly check-ins. His voice was different, softer. He said he'd been thinking about how much time had passed since his mother died, how he hadn't been there for me the way he should have been, how Vanessa and he wanted to make things right. Could he come for dinner that week? I said yes before he finished the sentence. My wife, Margaret, had died 22 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. The house in Bexley had been quiet in a way that felt structural after she was gone, like something load-bearing had been removed and the walls were simply waiting for the right moment to come down. I had our dog, a 12-year-old beagle named Francis, who slept at the foot of my bed and occasionally looked at me with the particular sadness of an animal that understands more than it should. Derek and I had not been close since Margaret's funeral. There had been a conversation about the estate that I preferred not to think about, his voice too eager, his questions too specific, the grief on his face wearing thin at the edges like a costume put on in haste. I had told him I wasn't discussing finances while I was still burying his mother. He had left early. Vanessa had not come at all, but November felt like a new start. He brought a bottle of wine. Vanessa brought a casserole dish and a smile that almost reached her eyes. We sat at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had eaten 30 years of dinners, and Derek talked about his job, his neighborhood, some renovation they were doing on their house in Worthington. He was careful not to mention money. He started coming every week after that, sometimes twice a week, always bringing food, dinners, baked goods, a thermos of coffee once because he said he'd made too much and it would go to waste. I drank it all. It was good coffee, rich and dark, the way I'd always taken it. The headaches started in December. Nina watched me read Derek's text. When I looked up, her expression had the careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say and was still afraid to say it. Come around to the consultation window, she said. Please. I followed her to the small private alcove at the end of the counter. She pulled up something on her screen, then turned it so I could see. You've been prescribed metoprolol for blood pressure for 6 years. Normal refills, no issues. She scrolled. 2 months ago, your doctor increased the dosage. Last month, he increased it again. Your last lab work showed abnormal results, elevated liver enzymes, unusual patterns that your doctor attributed to the medication adjustment. She stopped scrolling. Mr. Mercer, I also fill prescriptions for your neighbor on Linden Drive, Carol Whitfield. Last week she mentioned you'd been having memory issues and headaches. and that your son was very concerned about your cognitive decline. Nina's jaw was tight. I got curious. I looked up the symptoms you've been presenting: the memory fog, the tremors, the headaches, the liver irregularities. She wrote something on a notepad and slid it across the counter. Chronic low-dose heavy metal exposure. Easily acquired. Accumulates slowly. Mimics dementia. And neurological decline. I looked at the words for a long time. I could be completely wrong, Nina said. I'm not a doctor. I'm a pharmacist who has filled your prescriptions for 4 years and noticed a pattern. But Mr. Mercer. She hesitated. When I mentioned cognitive decline, did your son say anything about power of attorney? The table in Derek's dining room? 3 weeks ago. Papers spread out casually while Vanessa poured coffee. Just some estate planning documents, Dad. Mom would have wanted you to be protected. Sign here, and just initial at the bottom. I had looked at them, and something had snagged in my mind. Some old instinct. And I had said I wanted my lawyer to review them first. Derek's smile had stayed in place, but his eyes had gone flat and still, like a pond after a stone breaks its surface. He mentioned it, I said. Nina nodded once, slowly. Get a blood test. Don't go to your regular doctor. Go somewhere new. Somewhere your son didn't refer you to. She pulled the notepad back. And Mr. Mercer, don't tell him you know. I drove home on autopilot. 30 years of professional habit, locking my face into neutral while my mind ran the numbers. Motive. My estate. The house in Bexley had been appraised at $520,000 in October. I knew because Derek had casually mentioned he'd had a friend in real estate take a look at the neighborhood values. My retirement accounts and Margaret's life insurance together sat at just over $200,000. If Derek held power of attorney and I was declared cognitively impaired, he controlled all of it. Means access. He came every week. He brought food and coffee. He had a key I'd given him 3 years ago when I'd had knee surgery and needed someone to check on me. He knew my schedule, my habits, my doctors, opportunity. He'd had 4 months of it. The tremors in my hands were not age. The headaches were not stress. The mornings I couldn't find words that should have been simple were not the beginning of the end. They were a campaign, methodical, patient, and carefully designed to look like natural decline. I had spent 3 decades finding exactly this kind of scheme in corporate ledgers and offshore accounts. I simply hadn't expected to find it in my own kitchen. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house. Francis would be waiting by the door, his whole back end wagging the way it did when he heard the car. Inside were 30 years of a life Margaret and I had built together, the books she'd arranged by color on the shelves because she thought it was funny, the dent in the hallway wall from the time Derek was 12 and threw a baseball inside on a dare, the garden she'd planted along the back fence that I'd kept alive through 2 winters without knowing what I was doing. Derek had sat in this house and poisoned his father over a pot roast. I went inside. I scratched Francis behind the ears. Then I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop and started making a list. My neighbor Carol Whitfield had moved in 6 months ago, after her husband's death. She was 62, trim, with silver hair cut short, and a directness I had found startling at first, and then deeply refreshing. She was a retired family court judge. She brought over cookies when she moved in, told me she didn't like small talk but did like chess, and asked if I played. I did. We had fallen into a Tuesday evening routine without either of us proposing it formally. I called her that night instead of answering Derek's second text asking what time he should arrive. She was at my door in 10 minutes. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, listened without interrupting while I laid out everything Nina had told me and everything I had already known without letting myself know it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You need a blood test first, she said, before anything else. If there's nothing there, the rest of this changes shape. There's something there. She looked at me steadily. I believe you, but belief isn't evidence. You know that better than I do. She leaned forward. There's a clinic in Clintonville. No connection to your regular medical history. I can drive you tomorrow morning. You don't have to. I watched my husband decline for 2 years, Carol said, her voice even and careful. Parkinson's. Slow, and then fast. I know what neurological decline looks like, Harold. And I've watched you every Tuesday for 6 months. Her eyes held mine. What you have is not that. I had not let myself cry since Margaret's funeral. I didn't let myself now. But something shifted in my chest. Some pressure I hadn't known I was carrying. He's my only child, I said. Carol didn't offer false comfort. She said, I know. Then she got up and made tea, and we sat in the kitchen with Francis between our feet until well past 10 o'clock. The clinic in Clintonville ran a full panel the next morning. The doctor, a careful man in his 50s named Okafor who asked clear questions and wrote everything down, told me results would take 48 hours. He agreed, without requiring much explanation, that my symptoms were inconsistent with simple medication side effects. He ordered the specific tests Nina had suggested, along with others. While we waited, I moved. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had handled Margaret's estate and who I trusted completely. I drove to her office that afternoon and told her what I believed was happening. She listened with the focused attention of someone who had heard many things and was not easily surprised. If you're right, she said, the power of attorney documents he wanted you to sign would have given him full control the moment two physicians certified cognitive impairment. Given that one of your doctors has already noted neurological concerns on your chart, she paused. Harold, if you'd signed those papers, he might already have been positioning to have you assessed. I know. What do you want to do? I want a new will executed before the week is out, I said. And I want it to include the reason for any disinheritance. Clearly stated. And I want the power of attorney revoked whatever limited version he may have already had from 3 years ago. Patricia was already writing. Done. Who receives the estate? I thought about Margaret's hands in the garden. The volunteers at the literacy center, where she'd spent her Saturdays for 15 years. The Columbus Metropolitan Library Foundation, I said, and I want Derek to receive $1, with the reason stated clearly in the document. Patricia's pen moved without hesitation. It'll be executed and filed by Friday. On the drive back, I called Derek. Hey, Dad. His voice carried that careful warmth. You never answered last night. Everything okay? Just tired, I said. Listen, son. I've been thinking. I want to take you and Vanessa up on that dinner. How about Friday night? Your place? A beat of silence. Then, of course. Friday's perfect. Vanessa will be thrilled. The eagerness in his voice landed like a stone in still water. I'll bring wine, I said. Your mother's recipe for that apple cake, too. I finally figured out how she made it. After we hung up, I sat in the parking lot for a moment. 31 years of looking at people who had stolen from retirees, from pension funds, from families who trusted them. I had always maintained the professional distance of someone who understood that fraud was about systems and incentives, not personal evil. This was personal, but the discipline held. It always held. I started the car and drove to meet Carol, who was waiting at the hardware store with a list of security cameras she'd researched the night before. The blood test results came Thursday morning. Dr. Okafor called me himself. His voice was measured and precise, which was how I knew before he finished his first sentence that I had been right. Elevated levels. Consistent with chronic low-dose exposure over a period of approximately 3 to 4 months. Not enough to be acutely dangerous, but sufficient to cause exactly the symptoms I had been experiencing. He used the clinical term. He asked if I had a safe place to stay. He told me I needed to report this. I told him I was already working on it. I had stopped eating anything Derek brought 2 weeks ago, telling him I was watching my diet on doctor's orders. The headaches had already begun to ease. The fog was lifting in small increments, like windows being opened in a room that had been shut too long. That afternoon, I drove to the Columbus Police Department and asked for the Financial Crimes Unit. The detective who took my case was a woman in her late 40s named Agatha Pruitt, with reading glasses she kept taking on and off, and a quality of still attention that I recognized as the hallmark of someone who was good at their job. I laid out everything. Nina's concern, the blood work, the power of attorney documents, the timing of Derek's renewed interest in my life, the pattern of food and coffee brought to my home over 4 months. Detective Pruitt took notes, asked precise questions, and told me exactly what she could and could not do. The blood test establishes exposure. It doesn't establish source or who administered it. She set down her pen. If your son brought contaminated food or beverages into your home, and if we can connect what's in your system to something he provided, that's the chain we need. Do you still have anything he brought recently that you haven't consumed? The casserole dish from 2 Sundays ago. I hadn't thrown it out. I had set it in the back of the refrigerator without quite knowing why, some old professional instinct. The same one that made me keep receipts long past any reason to keep them. Pruitt's expression sharpened. Don't touch it. We'll send someone today. Friday came. I dressed carefully, drove to Worthington with a bottle of wine I'd selected at random from my own rack, and rang Derek's doorbell at 6:45. Vanessa answered in a dress that suggested occasion. The table was set nicely. Music played from somewhere in the back of the house, low and unintrusive. I played my part, the slightly distracted father, the man who'd been having some health concerns, who was grateful for his son's attention, who was perhaps a little more uncertain than he used to be. I mentioned that Dr. Okafor had suggested I see a specialist. I watched Derek's face when I said the name he wouldn't recognize, the doctor he hadn't referred me to, and saw the micro-calculation happen behind his eyes. Over the main course, I set my trap. I've been thinking about the house, I said, in the vague, circling way of someone who has been overthinking alone. Patricia Voss, my attorney, she thinks I should update everything. Wills, accounts, all of it. I told her I'd come in next week. Derek's fork slowed. That's a good idea, Dad. Have you thought about who you'd want involved? In the decision-making. I mean, if your health... Oh, I was actually thinking of simplifying, I said pleasantly. Liquidating some things. The house, maybe. A condo somewhere smaller. Use the rest to travel while I still can. Italy. Margaret always wanted to go to Italy. Vanessa's glass stopped halfway to her lips. Derek set his fork down completely. Dad, the house is, you shouldn't make that kind of decision quickly. You should talk to someone. To us. The warmth had thinned slightly, enough to see what was underneath. We're your family. You're right, I said, and smiled at him with everything I had from 3 decades of sitting across tables from people who thought they were fooling me. I'll think on it. The call came Saturday morning at 7:42. Detective Pruitt. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone delivering confirmed information. The casserole dish tested positive, she said. The same compound found in your blood work. We also have your pharmacy records showing the progression of symptoms, your physician's documented concerns, and the power of attorney documents you provided. A pause. We're prepared to make an arrest this morning if you want to proceed. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Francis was in his morning spot near the back door, watching a squirrel that had no idea it was being observed. The February light came in flat and pale through the windows Margaret had chosen because she said the morning light in the east-facing kitchen was the best light for beginning a day. Mr. Mercer? Pruitt's voice, careful. Yes, I said. I want to proceed. Are you all right? I thought about that. Then I said, honestly, I'm not sure yet. But yes. Derek was arrested at his home at 11:37 on a Saturday morning. Carol drove me to the station without being asked. She had seen Pruitt's number on my phone when it rang and had simply stood up and gotten her keys. In the car, she didn't say anything encouraging or comforting. She put on the radio to a station that played older jazz and drove with the easy competence of someone who had sat in difficult rooms for a living and understood that silence was sometimes the most useful thing you could offer a person. At the station, I gave a formal statement. I answered every question with the same methodical precision I had brought to 31 years of investigations, because that was the only way I knew how to do it. Driving home, I finally let myself feel it. It came in waves. Not tears, I couldn't quite get there, but something that moved through my chest in pulses, each one carrying a different weight. Derek, at 8 years old, showing me a science project about volcanoes, so proud of the papier-mâché he'd stayed up until midnight to finish. Derek at his wedding, nervous and young, asking me before the ceremony if I thought he was ready. Derek in my kitchen with a casserole dish and a patient, measured plan to watch his father disappear. He was in my house every week, I said. Not to Carol, really. just into the air. "I know," she said. "I taught him how to drive, how to file a tax return, how to change a tire." I looked at my hands on my lap. The tremor was still there but fading, day by day, as whatever he'd been giving me left my system. I don't know when it changed, or if it ever didn't. Carol was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Some people choose a path early and cover it carefully enough that you can't see it until they need you to stop seeing anything at all." She glanced at me. "That's not a failure of your fathering, Harold. That's a failure of his character." I turned back to the window. The city moved past, ordinary and indifferent to the thing that had just been dismantled. "I'm going to need some time," I said. "Of course you are." "Not from you," I added, and wasn't sure if I'd meant to say it out loud. There was a pause, and then Carol said quietly, "Good." 3 weeks later, Vanessa's attorney contacted Patricia Voss with a cooperation request. She had not known the full extent of Derek's plan. She claimed she had believed the substance was an herbal compound that would accelerate cognitive symptoms already present, not something introduced deliberately. Whether that distinction held up legally would be the prosecutor's determination. She agreed to testify. Pruitt called me herself to explain the charges: attempted murder in the second degree, elder abuse, fraud. The Financial Crimes Unit had discovered that Derek and Vanessa had already opened a joint account into which they'd planned to funnel my assets once the power of attorney was in place. The account had been opened 6 months ago, 1 month before Derek called me on that Sunday morning with his warm, careful, rehearsed voice and his offer of reconciliation. The planning had preceded the warmth. The warmth had been a tool. I sat with that fact for several days. I went to the literacy center, where Margaret had volunteered and donated an afternoon helping a man named Gerald learn to read well enough to get his GED. I walked Francis around the block twice each evening in the cold, watching his breath come in small white clouds and thinking about the spring Margaret had planted in the garden along the back fence and whether I knew enough to keep it going for another year. I had a conversation with Carol on a Wednesday that was not a Tuesday, which broke the pattern we'd established and somehow made it feel like the establishment of a different pattern. We were sitting on her porch despite the cold because she said she liked cold air and I found I didn't mind. She was talking about a case she'd presided over 30 years ago, a custody dispute that had changed how she thought about what families actually were. "Biology is a starting point," she said, "not a definition." I looked at her. She was looking at the bare maple in her front yard, her breath steady in the cold. "No," I said. "It's not." She turned, and we looked at each other in the straightforward way that people do when they've already passed the part of an acquaintance where things need to be said indirectly. "I'm not ready for anything," I said. "Neither am I," she said. "But here we are on my porch in February." "Here we are," I agreed. Francis sneezed in the carrier bag at my feet. We both laughed, which was possibly the first time I had laughed without any effort required since Margaret's diagnosis. The arraignment was in March. I sat in the courtroom with Carol beside me and Patricia Voss on my other side and watched Derek enter in a suit rather than a jumpsuit, because his attorney had argued for the dignity of civilian clothing, and the judge had allowed it. He was 41 years old, my son, and he looked exactly like himself, like the boy I had raised, except that his eyes wouldn't find mine anywhere in the room. Vanessa, having cooperated with the prosecution, received a suspended sentence and probation. She had already filed for divorce. I was not surprised. The plea was entered on a Wednesday afternoon. Attempted murder, second degree, elder abuse, first degree, 2 counts of fraud. The judge asked Derek if he understood the terms of his plea. Derek said he did. She asked if he had anything he wished to say to the court. Derek stood for a moment without speaking, and then he turned, not to the judge, but to the gallery, to where I was sitting, and said the only honest thing I had heard him say in months. "I'm sorry, Dad." 4 words in a voice I didn't recognize, because there was nothing performed about it. Just 2 syllables of damage and whatever comes after damage, offered into a room full of strangers, and one man who would have given almost anything to have never needed to hear them. I nodded once. He was let out. The door closed. Outside, in the gray March light, I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. Patricia touched my arm briefly before she left. Carol waited at the bottom of the steps. She didn't come up. She understood that this was a moment that required its own space, and she gave it to me without being asked. After a while, I walked down. April arrived like a concession. The garden along the back fence sent up the first green shoots in the second week, ahead of schedule, responding to a warm spell that felt almost like apology. I spent a Saturday morning with a gardening guide Margaret had kept on the kitchen windowsill, doing my best to understand what was coming up, and what was weed, and what was simply something that needed a different place to grow. Carol came over in the afternoon and identified the plants I'd been uncertain about, because she had gardened for 30 years and found my lack of knowledge charming in the way that people do when they have decided to be fond of you. We had dinner that evening at the kitchen table where my son had poisoned me over a pot roast. I had not changed the table. I thought I might. And then I thought about all the other dinners that had happened there. The good ones. The ordinary ones. The ones with Margaret laughing at something I'd said. The ones with Derek as a child doing homework in the chair closest to the window. The table was just a table. It held everything that had happened on it. But it was not defined by any single thing. Francis sat between our chairs the entire meal. He was old and slow and deeply committed to being wherever the people were. After dinner, while we washed dishes side by side at the sink, Carol said, without preamble, "I think I'd like to start a garden at your place. If that's all right. I've been eyeing that east-facing bed along the house since last summer." I handed her a dish to dry. Margaret planted the east bed. I know. She had good instincts. Carol dried the dish without looking at me. I won't change what she planted. I'd just be adding to it. I thought about that. About what it meant to add to something without erasing what was already there. That'd be all right, I said. In the kitchen drawer beside the stove, there was an envelope with a prison postmark that had arrived the previous week. I had set it there, unopened, and had not decided what to do with it. Maybe I would read it someday. Maybe when the garden was further along, when the east bed came up fully, when I had enough distance to hold both things at once, the man who had poisoned me and the boy who had learned to ride a bike in this driveway, and who was, in some way I was still working to understand, both the same person. But not today. Today, the kitchen was warm, and Francis was asleep on his mat. And Carol was proposing to plant something in the garden, and the evening light was exactly the kind of light Margaret had chosen this kitchen for 30 years ago. Some debts get paid, some wounds close. Some mornings you wake up in the house where the worst thing happened, and you find carefully, quietly, without rushing it, that you still want to be there. That's enough. For now, that is enough.